Okay, going to talk about Rousseau in this one, but this is a forward. um, I made a couple of mistakes in this video. I kept saying Nietzsche by mistake. Sometimes I say Nietzsche when I should say Rousseau. So I don't want to go back and redo the whole video. So if you hear me say Nietzsche, then I mean Rousseau, because Rousseau is the one I'm talking about, and I don't want to talk about Nietzsche in this video. So remember that I'm talking about Rousseau, and if I make a mistake, then just ignore it. All right. Right. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was he? What was he doing? Where did he come from? What was going on with him? Well, he was a French-speaking philosopher, but he was from Geneva, which is in Switzerland, and he did live in France for some time, and he was kind of friends with David Hume for a little while, but they fell out because Rousseau was really difficult to get on with and a bit of a cunt, really, as a person, apparently. And he wrote loads of really good things, though, and I really like Rousseau. I think he was fucking brilliant. Um, and I really, really enjoyed reading his books. He's one of he's probably the only one of these philosophers whose books I could just pick up and read and understand what he was talking about. All the others, on first reading, I didn't know what the fuck they were on about. It was like, what the fuck is this all about? You know, with all of them, Schopenhauer, Kant, Hume, Locke, I didn't understand a fucking word of it. I didn't know what they were talking about at all. So I had to then go and read about them and have these other sort of academics, in other books telling you what they meant, and then maybe watch a few videos about them as well, and go to some lectures and whatnot. And it really took a long time to sort of get the gist of what they were about. And then I went back to the books after doing all that, and then it was like, oh, okay, I get it now. Okay, I can see what he's saying here in this sentence or this paragraph or this page or this chapter, And I would say that honestly, though, with Rousseau, it really was an easy read, um, and he writes really nicely, and it's just really lovely to read. Um, and I would say the same about Voltaire as well. And I think I might do a video on Voltaire as well because he's good and he fits well with Rousseau. They're kind of often named together when people talk about the Enlightenment. Um, so anyway, so having said that about Rousseau, that he's nice to read, and being honest and saying that I didn't really get the others until people told me what they're about. Well, Rousseau was one of the great Enlightenment thinkers, and he's probably the most important one for the French Revolution. And the French revolutionaries, they considered Rousseau as their kind of inspiration, many of them. And now opinion about Rousseau is divided. Some people think he's brilliant, and some people think he's a cunt. So where do I stand on it? I actually think he's fucking brilliant, and that's my view. But you can make up your own mind. Now, Rousseau is very much a political philosopher, and he's not really into any of this sort of deep, what is the world? How do we know anything? How do I know I exist? Any of that sort of stuff, like Kant or even Hume or Spinoza or any of those guys. He's not into that stuff at all, really. Although there are some other things that he's into other than political philosophy, but we'll cover those as well. And Rousseau is also really, really influential in literature and art and poetry and the music and all that kind of thing. And he's often considered to be kind of the founding father of Romanticism as an intellectual movement. Um, so yeah, it's quite difficult to know where to start with Rousseau, because he's so interesting in lots of different ways, and he didn't just write one book and say one thing like some of these other cunts did. He actually sort of did more than that. Um, so, as I said, he was an Enlightenment thinker. He lived in the middle part of the 18th century. He was a contemporary of David Hume and Diderot and Montesquieu and Voltaire. And he okay, I think the best way to start with him is to talk about his Romanticism. Now, a lot of the other 18th century writers and quite a lot of 18th century intellectual culture and quite a lot of the Enlightenment was highly rational, and there's this word Baroque, which refers to architecture and refers to music. If you listen to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, now that's from the same sort of time period that we're talking about now, and it's very mathematical. It's very sort of structured, and it's very sort of mechanical the way it works. And there's something kind of mechanical and structural and mathematical about the way that a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers thought. And there's not much room really for the emotions. The emotions and being emotional is something that a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers aren't really interested in. It's part of what they would consider to be sort of hysterical, which is a word that a lot of people use to describe women when they think they're behaving in an illogical or irrational way, which is a bit sexist, you know. But anyway, Rousseau is often considered as being sort of hysterical and illogical and concerned too much with the feelings and the emotions rather than sort of rational, logical, if you understand what I mean. Now, Spinoza, if you remember, was really into the logical, the rational, and was against people being sort of affected and being emotional and being concerned with the psychological effects. And but what Rousseau is like, in contrast to that, and in contrast to many of the other thinkers of his time and before, and with many of the other Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau is someone who says that the emotional and the irrational, that's all good, and that's what you should sort of try to embrace rather than try to deny it. So he's a man who's very much in touch with his emotions and thinks that everybody else should be as well. And this is connected with nature. And if you think about nature and things being natural, well, it's natural to cry, it's natural to get upset, it's natural to fall in love. It's natural to go into a depression sometimes, it's natural to get excited about things. All those things are natural, and to try to suppress them and keep them down and try to sort of make people sort of like they're made of stone, that's not natural, that's man-made, and it's against nature. So as well as being into the emotions and all that, you've also got the concept of nature and what's natural, which is very important to Nietzsche. And he likes nature, he likes nature, and he likes the natural things. And that's connected with his idea of emotions, because emotions, they're natural to have. And sort of stoicism, or putting on a brave face, or having a stiff upper lip, or pretending that everything's all right when it isn't. That's not natural. That's man-made, and you're repressing what's natural about you as an animal and as a human being when you do that. So I think this is probably the best way to get into Rousseau. So now this meant that as a person he was also quite emotional and stuff, and this is why he sometimes had problems with people. Um, Now he loved flowers and plants, and his sort of favorite hobby was botany. And botany means, gardening basically, and growing plants and flowers and knowing all about plants and flowers. So he was really into nature, actually nature, like plants and things, as well as sort of metaphors about nature in people and stuff like that. So if you think about nature and flowers and landscapes and things like that, and you think about emotions and the spirit of people being emotional and not entirely rational, and you think about romanticism that comes later, and romantic music and romantic art and romantic novels and all the rest of it, then you can see how it kind of does somehow come from Nietzsche. And nature is also very important for his politics. So it's very important before we start with the politics to say that Nietzsche doesn't like culture and civilization that much. Now, most people think that civilization is a really good thing, and that the more civilized we are, and the more sort of advanced as a civilization society is, the better for everybody. Like you wouldn't want to go back and live in the Stone Age. It would be rubbish, because you wouldn't have anything there. It'd be awful. And most people think that sort of living in the modern world is great, because you've got modern medicine and modern science and all the rest of it, and modern culture and society. You've got institutions like democracy and education and universities and transport and all these modern things that make life better. And you wouldn't want to go in a time machine and go and live in the jungle in the in olden times. Similarly, a lot of people think that living in a more civilized country or a more developed country is better than living in a country that's a little bit more that isn't as developed. So in America, there's these Amish people, and they live in a society with no technology, and they just sort of work the fields and stuff and use horses and things, and they've never seen an iPhone or a laptop computer, and they wouldn't know what one was. But most people wouldn't want to live in that community. They'd rather live with their iPhones and their laptop computers and everything else. Now, of course, Rousseau was living in the 18th century, so of course they didn't have as much stuff as we have now. But Rousseau didn't think that all the stuff of the civilization that he was living in was that great, and he didn't think that living in sort of what was modern France at the time, with people wearing tailored clothes and having makeup and wigs and having musical instruments and having all the kings sitting on thrones and politicians telling you what to do, and organized religions and all of the things of a sort of developed 18th century civilized society. He didn't think that they were that good either. And he kind of thought that maybe like the Native Americans had a better life than some of the people living in 18th century France. And he thought that maybe going back in time and living in sort of the Stone Age, it might be better, or there might be things about it which are better than things about the 18th century France. And he thought that the way that society and technology and civilization and everything had developed had not necessarily made everything fucking better for everyone, you know. So um, he's very different from most other people, because most people sort of think that, you know, we've come and developed and progressed, and you know, so he doesn't think that way. So some examples he has are health and fitness. So he says, you know, look at the Native American people, and you know, they're all in good physical condition because they have to work and they have to be fit and healthy in what they do. And you look at them in the films. I don't know if you've seen them, or you see them living in the jungle, or in the mountains or the forests or wherever it is, and they live closer to nature, and they have to hunt and they have to climb and all this and run and stuff, and they're physically in good condition. Whereas you look at modern people and you see these fat fuckers, don't you, that don't do fuck all, and they've got massive fucking bellies, and they drink wine and they smoke, and they, you know, they're, is it that good? You know, wouldn't they be healthier and happier living in the jungle or the forest and hunting the deer? You know, wouldn't that be better than sitting in a fucking dusty room drinking claret and smoking a fucking pipe? You know, so um, then as a, so that's sort of general. That's a general thing. So he doesn't try to argue that everything is better in sort of a less civilized society, but he does generally sort of think that civilization isn't all it's cracked up to be, basically, and he criticizes and argues against the people that say that it is. Um, and he admires less civilized cultures, and like the American Indians, for example, you know. So there's an anthropological element to Rousseau's philosophy, as well as a sort of historical element to it. Now, to get into his politics, I think the way to start is to keep this in mind about how he feels about civilization and nature, and also then to think and remember John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Now, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes had both talked about the state of nature as opposed to living in a civil society with a government and political system and systems of laws where you're protected from other people by the police, and where you have such a thing as property and all these things. That's a civil society. You know, we live in civil societies now, whereas a state of nature is a condition where you can just do whatever you want all the time, and there's no laws. There's no such thing as money. There's no such thing as the police or a government or a king. There's no such thing as a bank or a concept of crime or punishment. And it's like if you dropped a load of people on an island and they could do whatever they want, you know, then that would be a state of nature. And people historically lived in a state of nature in the past before societies were created and developed. And also everybody kind of sort of in the background is in a state of nature, in the background to living in a civil society, because a civil society could easily collapse back into a state of nature if all of the institutions and the laws fell apart, and you know, we all descended into chaos. Now, Hobbes had said that that would be shit, living in a state of nature, because everyone would be fucking everyone over all the time, and the big fish would eat the little fish, and you'd be fucked on all the time. And because people are basically all cunts in reality, it's only laws and systems of morality that keep them from eating each other alive, and non-stop, and life being a non-stop murder rape session, you know. That's what Hobbes thinks that it would be like. It would be just be non-stop murder and rape and, you know, and whatnot. And life wouldn't be very good and no one would have any safety or security. And that means that for that Hobbes, because of that, Hobbes says that whatever kind of government you've got to stick with it, and you can't go against it, and nobody has any rights against the government, because any government or leader or ruler is better than living in a state of nature. You know, even if the king is a complete cunt, you can't get rid of him because he's better than state of nature. And Locke had a different view. Locke had said that yeah, living in a civil society is better than living in a state of nature, because you've got all these laws and things that protect you, but it doesn't follow that the king or the government can do whatever they want. He says the government or the king or whatever you've got is there because you want to live in a civil society, and that civil society has to be better than a state of nature. And if it isn't fit to purpose, and it doesn't fit the purposes that you require, then the people have a right to change it and overthrow it and replace it with something else. And both of these ideas they call social contract ideas, because they both have the idea, Hobbes and Locke both have the idea that there's a social contract between people and their governments or their leaders. And Hobbes kind of said, well, it's a one-way contract because you have to stick with it, because the alternative for the contract is madness. And Locke had a different view. He said, well, the contract is a deal between the two sides, and if the government fails to fulfill its obligations in the contract, then the other party of the contract, the people, have a right to get rid of him and change him and make a new contract with some other people to get them in government. You know, so those are social contract theories which talk about states of nature against civil societies. And Rousseau also is talking about social contracts and talking about state of nature versus civil society. So I think that's the best way to get into Nietzsche's politics. So Nietzsche wrote 2 books about politics, and one of them was called The Discourse on Inequality, and the second one was called The Social Contract. So what he talks about is the state of nature, and he says that in a state of nature everyone's free to do whatever the fuck they want, the same as what Locke and Hobbes said. And he said in a state of nature there's no such thing as property, and there's no such thing as I own this shit and all this shit is mine, and there's no such thing as you've got to fucking do what I tell you, you know. And everyone's sort of free to do whatever they want. And he says that inequality isn't natural. He says he doesn't believe that there would be big fish eating a little fish in a state of nature. He says that in a state of nature, everyone's equal as well as being free. So not only are you free to do whatever you want, you're just as good as everybody else in a state of nature. And naturally everyone's equal to each other, you know. So in society, because of the way society is developed, you've got rich people and poor people, and you've got upper class people and lower class people, you've got lords and ladies and kings and queens and princesses, and you've got peasants and, you know, homeless and people that aren't worth shit. And all of this isn't natural. It's not natural that some people deserve to live in a palace and that some people deserve to live on the streets. There's nothing natural about that whatsoever. That's all made by society. That's all socially constructed. It's people forming these governments and these institutions and these customs and these laws that have created these systems of inequality. And if you look at how they work mostly in the interest of a very small group of people, and against the interests of the vast majority of people. So you've got all these fat cunts in charge, you know, the fucking aristocrats and the fucking kings and the princes and all these cunts, and they're fucking shitting all over everybody else, and the vast majority of people have to fucking get up and work every day in some shit job that they hate just to put food on the table, and then they have to give most of the stuff they fucking earn to some cunt just because he's richer than them, you know. So and this isn't from nature, this is from society, this has been constructed by people. And so for Rousseau, this is all shit stuff about society, and shit stuff about civilization, shit stuff about culture. And therefore, if you're a normal person, if you're some peasant or someone, unless you're some rich cunt or some lord, then you'd probably be better off living in a state of nature than you are living in a civil society, right? So because there's all this inequality and all this oppression and stuff that you get living in something like 18th century France, you'd be better off without it. You'd be better off in a state of nature. You'd be better off with everyone going around doing whatever the fuck they wanted. So this is extremely revolutionary, because what it means is that for most poor fuckers living in France at the time, and some other countries as well, you might as well have a revolution. You might as well go and fucking tip the car over and chuck the fucking petrol bomb through the window and shoot the fucker in the head, because any, you know, it's all shit, you know. So he's completely the fucking opposite of these conservative guys like Burke, who comes along later and says you've got to preserve what you have, you know. And he's also the opposite of Hobbes, because Hobbes was saying, well, you've got to keep what you've got, and you know, and state of nature would be madness and terrible. Well, Rousseau is saying state of nature for most people would be fucking better than living in unequal class society with all this shit and people smoking opium or whatever, and fat cunts making you give them money, and institutions like the church, and institutions like the monarchy, and institutions like the aristocracy, and all this shit. You know, we'd be much better off without all that, and therefore people should sort of get wise. And that's sort of what the discourse on inequality was all about. And he said that the first time that some cunt put up a fence and said, this is mine, that was when people started to lose their freedom and lose their natural equality, and that civil society came into existence. And he doesn't think that that's a good thing. Okay, so the social contract is the next thing. And the social contract deals more with how a government or a political system or a society should work, so that everybody can sort of be getting sort of a fair deal in the thing, rather than it just being some cunt sticking on everybody else. Because he thinks that the development of civil society and the political systems that exist in his time is not the result of any kind of beneficial or mutually beneficial sort of dealings between people. He thinks it comes about from people dicking on other people, people getting stuff together and creating and becoming rich and saying, I've got this and I'm gonna get more of it, and you know, I'm gonna be the king and these are gonna be the lords, and all this. And it's developed historically by oppression and sort of tricking people, and it isn't in any way, you know, 18th century monarchy is in no way consistent with a system that you'd have if everybody was sort of involved in agreeing on a system that would be beneficial for everybody. You know, like Locke was saying that you're trying to get a system that's beneficial for everybody, and that's the point of having a government, because it's there for the people. Well, Rousseau is saying that it's not working, you know, the sort of government they've got at that time in France, or wherever else it might be, where it's shit. Anyway, so Rousseau comes up with this theory of the social contract and this idea of the general will. So the social contract is basically the same kind of thing as Hobbes and Locke were talking about, and it's a sort of it's a deal of having a society and a government and all that. But it's not just between some vague idea of the people and the government. It's a contract between all the people, and it's only going to work if everybody's getting something out of it. It's not going to work if the whole of society is just about making rich people richer or giving kings more power. That's not going to work. You know, the social contract is about all the citizens of the society. So what Rousseau gets into next is he gets into the idea that, well, it's not going to work if you've just got a group of people who happen to maybe be bigger than other people, who then are using all the laws and the constructs of a society to sort of make themselves better at the expense of the others. So it's not just about the majority. So, I mean, if you've got 10 people going for a pizza and, 7 of them want a pepperoni pizza, but the other 3 don't like pepperoni. Now, if you're going to just go with the majority, then you're going to get a pepperoni pizza. But that's not going to be very good for the other 3. And for Rousseau, those 3 people are just as important as the other 7. So instead of getting a pepperoni pizza, then they should get something that they're all going to be happy with, And if the 7 cunts love a pepperoni pizza, and the 3 are allergic to it, then it's better to get something that the 7 like, but not quite as much as pepperoni, a second favourite, so that the other 3 can have a bit as well. And it's sort of for everybody, and not just for the ones that manage to get the upper hand in the group. And then you expand that onto a national level. So the general will isn't the will of or what one group wants over another. It's what everybody can kind of agree on, and a kind of sort of happy medium for everybody, and everyone can sort of agree with it. Now, some people say that he's a totalitarian, and he's saying that everybody has to be the same, and that society has to sort of be some uniform thing that's the same for everybody and keeps everybody down, and it's going to be an oppressive thing. But I don't see it that way. I see it more like, if you look at modern politics, some countries have systems of elections where the winner takes all. So you end up with a political party in government which represents a group of people, and they're doing everything that group of people wants, and then the other people who didn't win the election, they're getting shat on and being miserable. Whereas other countries have an election system where you end up with nobody having the complete power, and you end up with 3 or 4 political parties having to get together and make a deal where nobody gets the full everything they want, but then nobody's getting completely dicked on, and you have a sort of system where you get this general will that comes out at the end, where it's sort of a compromise position that everyone can agree on. So yeah, in the social contract, Rousseau is all about trying to find something that's kind of going to be all right for everybody, not just for one group or another. And one of the famous things that he says is, man is born free, but he is everywhere in chains. And what he means by that is that in a state of nature, everyone can do what they like and is free. And in a society, because you've got a class system, or you've got a system actually of slavery, which they had in those times, or you got to work for some cunt as a peasant on his land, or whatever it is, then you're a slave, but you're a slave because of the system and the laws and the civil society that you're in, and it's nothing to do with nature. It's not natural, as I already said. So the natural thing is for people to be equal and free, and the way to keep equality and freedom in a civil society is to have a government and an institution, a society, which is run by the people collectively and also in the interests of the people collectively as a whole, rather than being just one group winning over against another group, so that nobody's going to be a slave because everyone's going to be in it together, kind of a thing. And that kind of makes sense when you think about situations in small groups, when you're doing something, you're going out for dinner with somebody, and you're not going to cook. If someone comes around for dinner, if your son's got a new girlfriend and she comes around for dinner, and she's a vegetarian, and you and all your friends are and the rest of your family like eating meat, you're not going to give her meat just because she's in a minority. You're going to give her some fucking carrots or whatever, and that's good for everybody, and anyway, so yeah. And Rousseau also had this idea about education as well, that you should sort of be natural with kids and you should embrace their emotions and shouldn't try to sort of force them to be sort of like robots and just conform to society. And you should have a system where you kind of embrace nature and embrace the emotions with them, rather than just tell them that they're not allowed to cry, or they're not allowed to feel bad, or they're not allowed to get angry, and that kind of thing. And there's this idea about the emotions and stuff. Now, a lot of English people are cunts, and they say, oh, it's French, it's foreign, it's all la-di-da, it's girly. Oh, it's not like a manly thing to be emotional and have emotions. That's like, and these people are a bunch of fucking cunts. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about. They're all pricks. Anyway, so and Rousseau's being interested in nature and in sort of emotional honesty in people, and also saying that you should get rid of all this inequality in society and have something that works for everybody better, so people can be free and equal. It's extremely influential to everything, and it changed the world really, because the French Revolution was all about freedom, equality, and fraternity. Well, fraternity is like brotherhood. It's people working together and considering each other as kind of like brothers and sisters. And that was a part of Rousseau's social contract, that you kind of treat each other like your brothers and sisters in the society, and you aren't in competition with each other and trying to do each other over. You're together, And as for freedom and equality, well, that's natural and that should be preserved. And if you've got a society and a government which is making you a slave and making you unequal, then that's wrong and that's unnatural, and you should get rid of it, and get back your freedom and your equality, your rights. So when the French Revolution happened later on, that was what they were going on about. They were going on about freedom and equality and brotherhood and stuff. And they were waving around these Rousseau books and saying that he was fucking brilliant, And people like Edmund Burke and these conservative guys started saying that they thought Rousseau was a cunt because they didn't like him and they didn't like the French Revolution. So now, in terms of the emotions and being in touch with nature, there's a connection between the emotions and nature. And what you find is that in romantic poetry, you've got people talking about the flowers and the seasons and sun shining and the stars in the sky, or whatever it is, and that's sort of kind of metaphors for life and for people's emotions and stuff. And the romantic poets that came along, like Shelley and Byron and Keats and whatever, they were all influenced, and Wordsworth and Coleridge, they were all influenced by Rousseau, uh, and um, and also many artists as well. And there's this whole movement called Romanticism, and it's very much inspired by Nietzsche, because he, going around in circles, because he embraced emotions, whereas most clever people of the Enlightenment in the 17th century as well had been saying, well, you've got to be more logical and more rational. But for Rousseau, that was against nature. And so, just to recap with Nietzsche, he's all into nature and what's natural against what's man-made. He thinks the man-made stuff is quite often worse than what's natural. Now, this means that in when you're talking about the social contract and you're talking about a state of nature versus a society, it means that a lot of things about the society are shit because they're man-made, and you'd be better off in a state of nature. Now, Rousseau doesn't think it's possible to go back to a state of nature, and that's why he starts talking about how to make society more equal and more free for everybody, um, so it can be more natural and that. But he's not saying that we should take all our clothes off and go into the forest, even though he might think that that would be better, but that's not what he's advocating. He's advocating changing the political system and changing the social structures so that everybody gets something out of it, rather than it just being enriching a few cunts at everybody else's expense. And this is all tied together with his belief system in natural equality and natural freedom. And a lot of people sort of argue about whether Rousseau is left-wing or right-wing. A lot of people say that he's maybe a bit of a fascist or something, but because he's talking about what's in it for everybody together. But I personally think that, I think that he's more for a sort of a better sort of democracy where people all get together and share things and sort of get on with each other better, rather than try and dick each other over, which I think is a good thing. And he's absolutely one of the most, if not the most important political thinker in history, I think. You could argue that Karl Marx might be a bigger deal, but I think Rousseau is a lot better than Karl Marx, you know. Anyway, so there's not much more to say about Rousseau other than that he also wrote an autobiography, which is called The Confessions, and he writes all about his life, and it's an interesting read, and it's very, very well written, and it's a real joy to read, and I would say that not only is it easy to read Rousseau and understand it, but it's actually really enjoyable to read Rousseau. It's nice, pleasant to read. His language is beautiful, and it's just great. If you read it in French, obviously that's great. If you can speak French, understand French, but English translation of it is just great. It reads very well. You know, it's not like Kant or Spinoza. I mean, it's really nice to read. Yeah. Anyway, I think I've sort of summed him up. I hope you understand that he's all about nature. He doesn't like civilization so much and technology and all that stuff, and the advancement of civil and institutions. And he thinks that we'd be better if we didn't have all the modern stuff. And he thinks that like government and society and laws and things mostly work in the interests of just a few cunts and make everybody else worse off than they would be if they were running around the forest. And he thinks that we can't go back to running around in the forest, so we're going to have to try to have a revolution and overthrow and change the systems of government and laws that we have to make them so that they do work in everyone's interests, and that people can be free and equal, which is more natural than what we've got now. And that's kind of what inspires all the poor cunts to rebel against the lords and the kings and the princes during the French Revolution. Of course, he's not the only man to influence the French Revolution, but he's an important part of the Enlightenment, and one of the major ones. Now, we're going to do Voltaire next, and Voltaire is also another really important part of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, because he kind of kicks the shit out of religious institutions and fanaticism. And religious institutions and fanaticism is another really important part of the Enlightenment. Well, being against religious institutions and fanaticism and whatnot. But we'll do Voltaire next. But Rousseau is brilliant. By the way, Rousseau and Voltaire didn't like each other. Didn't get on with each other. They argued and they were kind of against each other. I think mainly it was because Rousseau was all sort of emotional and all that, whereas Voltaire was more sort of be logical and whatnot, and he was against all emotional stuff and that. But anyway, so that's Rousseau. There he is.